Thank you, everybody. And I'll reiterate what I said before, which is if you submit questions to us, we will do our best to get them answered, and we'll put them out. You will definitely be hearing, if you heard about this event, you'll be hearing about Jared's paper when it comes out. We will certainly include that in our newsletters. So I'd like to welcome to the stage our next panel. We are having the return of the Honorable Christian Dorsey. And we have traveled throughout the day from the past and the present into the future. So now we are entering the Voices from the Future panel. I'm very excited to hear what all of these folks have to say. We thought about inviting some politicians to tell us what they thought, but we thought that we'd switch that around a little bit and ask the politician to come and ask us what we think. So that's what Christian is going to do. We're starting with the us of our future here, the four members of the future of Arlington. But then we hope we'll have time to open it up to the audience for questions. And definitely stick around for the reception following the event. There is a bar. Hopefully that helps. So, Christian, take it on.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. And while our panelists are getting mic'd up, this is, of course, the Voices from the Future panel, and their extensive bios are in your program materials. But just to give you a brief flavor of who you're looking at, as I go over to my far right, you're looking at Adele McClure, who is the Director of Policy and Outreach for Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax. We have Tania Bougebrayel, who is the President of the Arlington Young Democrats. In her professional life, she is a security consultant with a focus on Middle East affairs. Next to Tania, we have Eric Brescia, who is an economist in the mortgage industry, who also serves as a commissioner on Arlington's Housing Commission. And then we have Saul Reyes, who is the executive director of BUGATA, which is a community-based organization that, among other things, does tenant advocacy, leadership development for Arlington's youth. And interestingly, Saul is not just the executive director. He at one time was a client or a participant in BUGATA's programs when he was youth under Lois Athey. Were you in charge of BUGATA at the time, Lois? Wonderful how things all come together. But anyway, so for this Voices of the Future panel, we thought it would be great, given that our panelists were able to hear a lot of the presentations, to really reflect on what we've heard and to see if there was anything that stood out for you that was thought-provoking. You kind of had an aha moment of an idea or perspective that was raised from the other presentations. So why don't we start in the order I introduced you with Adele.
Hi, is this on? All right. Hi there, I'm very happy to be here and extremely happy that we're here discussing this issue and learning about it, because one of the important things about moving forward is learning about our history and how it truthfully happened. So one of the things that I thought was thought-provoking was the increasing class segregation, economic segregation, and that aligns with increasing wealth inequality nationwide. So that was troubling within itself, but it was also troubling because of the huge wealth gap between whites and minorities, specifically African Americans. And then the other thing was the physical racial walls that were mentioned earlier. I grew up in poverty in Alexandria specifically, and in low-income areas, so housing vouchers, homelessness, all of these things were part of my family, and I never thought about the fact that when a physical wall was put up in my neighborhood, that was a racial divide. And so just being here and listening to that was extremely thought-provoking for me personally, and then also on a policy level, thinking about those barriers that we need to address going forward, not just the physical ones, but the ones that exist in policies.
Thank you, Adele. Tania?
Thank you so much for having us. There's a couple of notes that I made here throughout the day of things that really resonated with me. The first thing that I wrote down were two issues that were mentioned by Senator Kaine. And he spoke to both affordability, but also access to capital and credit. And I really find that to be an interesting discussion. He discussed vibrant institutions and the need to have them be inclusive. And I wanted to kind of flesh that out a little bit more and see how is that applicable to the current housing situation. how do these apply? And I, as maybe not the token millennial, but as one of the millennials here, I really see that there might be a bit of a change in the narrative to include younger voices as well, specifically in Arlington County. As a quote-unquote millennial, I don't think that our issue with affordable housing comes down to eating too much avocado toast, if you guys have read that article. I think it's far deeper than that. I think a lot of us are crippled by student debt, and I think a lot of us face many barriers that are similar that we've discussed, particularly regarding economic exclusion. I think we need to kind of open this discussion to include young folks in it as well. And then I was kind of had a few questions, and Christian, maybe you can touch on this a little bit, but I was curious, what, if any, were there any specific lot size requirements, any sort of exclusionary zoning in Arlington, if they did exist, and if so, what are they going to look like in 5 years? What are they going to look like in 50 years? Love to hear your thoughts. I always love to pick your brain when we talk about housing.
All right.
And then I also kind of, wanted to discuss the issue of diversity in neighborhoods and linking that to the schools. And why is that so significant when it comes to growth, specifically for Arlington County?
Thank you, Tanya. And I think during the discussion, I'll get to that very important question, because I would surmise that Arlington doesn't have an exclusionary zoning problem per se when it comes to de facto zoning laws, but I do think there's an argument to be made that we have exclusionary policies that we enforce and reinforce as we go about our daily business. But more on that later. You'll just have to stay. Eric.
Yes. Technically, I guess I'm one of those older millennials too, so I definitely know the path of trying to find housing in this county. I've lived there for 11 years. I've moved from rather falling apart old garden apartment to garden apartment as I moved my trajectory here, so I understand that broader affordable housing challenge. It isn't just the demographics we usually think about. And I probably am going to have a lot to say about zoning later in this discussion, as I do a lot of that in my professional work. But to the specific question, I guess the thing that kind of hit me as a little bit of an emotional thing today is that I am familiar with the stories about the literal racial segregated walls, and I know about restrictive deed covenants and so forth. But I guess as someone who's just in their mid-30s, you kind of think of this explicit racism as more of an abstract in the history books type of thing. And I was kind of moved by Senator Kane's talk about the insurance company. It kind of hits you as that, well, wow, that was actually around when I was in diapers. It wasn't all that long ago. So I do think as we talk in the future, lots about zoning I will mention in a bit, but that kind of hit that the explicit stuff wasn't all that long ago.
Thank you. And so,
thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight, joining this discussion. I think that we heard some very important and new ideas that we should be considering, and we should look into making changes and implementing those changes into policies that, in fact, are discriminating and segregating communities. We've heard stories from the first panel, which is very important to put faces to stories. We've heard about the importance of housing and understanding what challenges people face. I like the stories that Senator Kane shared and how that first initial experience was thrilled. He was thrilled and to make it his expertise. I'm a similar story. I got involved when I was at a young age through the Buckingham Youth Brigade, a youth program that my organization sponsors. And so I too agree with you and all of us here that it is very important to get the youth involved in understanding these issues so that they can too be here participating and be the voice for themselves and help make those decisions that would affect their future and those of their children as well. One important point one of the previous panelists mentioned was also to marry those stories with data that this researchers have collected, and also to see those patterns and comprehend those patterns and do a comprehensive analysis to better address the needs of the community. Also, another thing that stood out to me is that the walls, not just the physical, but the invisible walls that we've heard of today, and also how there's also economic and racial segregation, not only in housing, but also within the schools and task force, and even within the programs themselves, which sometimes segregate kids from the mainstream. So it's very important to link the housing and school integration policy together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it seems that for all of you in some way, the sort of bringing together of history to be not all that distant from where we are, as I guess Senator Kane broke it up, we're looking at really one of the 8 half centuries in our evolution where we've, at least from a statutory place, been past these things while the vestiges remain. So given that as backdrop, I'm very curious, because in Arlington we're very proud of our own role in that modern history, being a place where we resisted segregation, being a place that far earlier than maybe other places in the Commonwealth has embraced what some people might call a more inclusive version of community. I'm not interested in all that. I'm interested in where we have to go to actually marry the rhetoric with reality, given that, you know, we're talking about things that were not in our altogether distant past. So whomever wants to opine. All right, Eric, go ahead. Start off.
So not that, and maybe we're going to disagree a little bit on the defining the words here. Not that this wasn't talked about today in mentioning about exclusionary zoning and so forth, but to me, if you're going to truly be an inclusive, welcoming, growing community, or a region, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about housing, it's not just a matter of can you subsidize enough units and ban enough practices and poke prod, so forth, to get a demographic mix in an area what you like. It's also a matter of, are you going to allow people in, how welcoming broadly? If you only have 4 homes and 5 families looking to get into it, you can poke prod, mandate, ban, do whatever you want. Somebody is still going to be excluded. So I think this region has a broader problem with housing supply generally. And I know this isn't mutually exclusive to a lot of people in this room when we talk about this, but I don't think it's talked about enough, because we usually just think about what is the affordable subsidized units, where they're going to be. Even if a unit isn't explicitly going to a low-income person, it's adding to the supply, it's reducing pressure on price, and it makes it less expensive to even do the subsidized units. So related to this, and also talk today, we oftentimes talk about, well, we're just fighting the market forces, that's the market rate, so forth. We act like this is some independent, exogenous thing that just happens to us. We're a victim to it. But housing is not a market that operates on the principles of laissez-faire. It is highly controlled by land use, as we've discussed today. So pull up a zoning map of any major municipality around here, and you're going to quickly realize that the vast majority of land, by law, is designated to only be used for single-family homes. Now, regardless of the motivation for that or the reasons, I realize urban planning is complex. It has the very real effect of roping off most of our land resources in this region and saying that is for the exclusive use by comparatively rich people. And it's not just a segregation and wealth inequality issue. It's restricting how many people can get, regardless of their income, to high-paying job markets. It's restricting how many people, regardless of income, can get into good school districts. And there's a lot of research in the last 5 years on the national scale that is showing that this isn't just an inequality and a segregation issue. It's also one of the reasons why economic growth has been so sluggish, why wage growth has been so sluggish. We're slowing the economy down by not allowing this to work. So when we like to pat ourselves on the back, I think, a lot in this county, and there are reasons to do that. But I don't think that when push comes to shove, the thing that is valued in this county more than allowing more people in is to protect the character of the neighborhood. And that's not just an arbitrary market force, that is a policy decision. So it's up to you guys.
Well, Eric, you might not have been here for my opening remarks, but you sound like a very wise young man. I'll just put it that way. Anybody else want to talk about some of the things to actually match up that rhetoric with reality? So housing, supply, and reducing those barriers that artificially suppress it. It's great. Anything else?
I think you kind of you guys can hear me. I think you kind of touched on this a little bit. But there's something to be said about the community and the value of the community and wanting to be inclusive. I recently went to a roundtable that was actually hosted by County Board, and I live in 22204, proud resident of 22204, yeah, woo!
Down there with you too.
I love my neighborhood. I've recently moved there. I've been there for about a year, just over a year now, and I have no intention of leaving. It was fascinating to hear the discussion that was happening in the room, and a lot of discussion circled around housing. And I was really surprised to hear that many people said, well, I don't necessarily want this in my neighborhood. Or the opposite of, well, maybe we can, but what's in it for me? And that's how I've never approached housing that way. I've always seen it as I want my neighborhood to be diverse. I am an immigrant myself. I grew up in lower income housing when I was a child in Cleveland. Shout out to Cleveland when we were talking about it earlier. So I look for that and I value that, and I think immigrants can bring a lot to the community, and I was really surprised because I think of Arlington as a bubble, and I like to think that here we tend to be quite progressive in our thinking. And so to hear that from some folks that live in my community, I was like, wow, I was quite caught off guard. And I walked away thinking, I didn't really expect it. And then my second thought, and excuse my biases here, was, well, I almost expected this from the north, but maybe not necessarily from this community. And so I think there's something to be said on that as well, of how is each community, even in Arlington, how do they view immigrants and how do they view diversity? And what's there to be said about inclusion within the community first, before we can even get into a policy discussion?
Indeed.
I just want to piggyback on what Tania and Eric said. It's up to us as individuals and as a community to challenge our biases and how we are thinking about what our neighborhood is going to look like. And we need to kind of move away from that thought of NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. We want these policies to change, but not around me or not next door to me, right? So we need to get out of that mindset. And it's much easier to implement better zoning laws and better education policies and integration of housing if we change the culture and remove implicit biases from the situation.
So?
I too myself, I am in agreement with every one of you. I was also present at the same roundtable.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yes.
Were you as surprised as I was about some of the discussion?
Actually, I've been involved in the discussion. I was a participant in the affordable housing study. And one of the issues is, the people keep bringing up is geographic distribution. But like Eric was saying, zoning would have to, it's one of the major challenges there that needs to be changed to provide that opportunity to expand housing to other places for, as they call it, geographic distribution. But also, there's also been discussion along with the school boundaries. How do you provide that? So all of those things have to be revisited to be able to provide a truly inclusive opportunity for everyone from all walks of life, immigration status, or nationality, where they come from. Yeah.
Indeed.
If I can just
go ahead, Adele.
add on, Arlington has some pretty good policies and initiatives in place that we could continue, to uphold. And so, for example, the Arlington Landlord Partnership, which is part of the 10-year plan to end homelessness in Arlington, increases availability of housing to those individuals who would have otherwise have had barriers to housing, and specifically homeless individuals, which, by the way, in Arlington, homelessness. There's a disproportionate number of African Americans facing homelessness. So this is one issue that we're going to, focus on going forward. And, another thing is we heard it earlier today, is to incentivize landlords or continue to incentivize landlords to accept housing vouchers, right? In those high opportunity areas for people to, have an opportunity to get out of poverty and have better access to education and other opportunities.
Thank you. So, I've heard you all in terms of specific ways to move forward. It's focusing on housing supply, irrespective of means testing, who you're going to make eligible for units you help create as a way of creating a change and shift in the market. And then there's this more nuanced or maybe more ethereal attitudinal shift that you're identifying among people with respect to what they are going to embrace in their own neighborhoods and communities, or what various stakeholders will in terms of who occupies their buildings. Given that we heard so many ideas today, so many perspectives, I'm curious, as you reflect on your own personal journeys, and we'll start this end and move that way, as you reflect on your own personal journeys making your way in Arlington, is there something that we have not yet identified or has not been discussed that would have made a difference for you and for people like you in trying to, sort of stake their claim here as part of this community?
Having grown up in Arlington and working also in Arlington, particularly with the Latino population and low-income immigrant communities, major challenge is in housing. And within that, even though we have programs for, say, affordable housing, even within them, there are challenges that affect the community. I myself being a Latino and working heavily with the Latino population as well, I can tell you that the most challenged population has been the Latino community. We know that statistics and studies in the county show that the population was at a little bit over 18% back in the year 2000, and not long after that, by 2010, the population went down to like 15 point some percent. There have been challenges that they faced due to income, certifications, proving incomes. After 9/11, most owners started requiring Social Security numbers. Also, if that wasn't available, ITIN numbers, which are used for tax purposes, with the claim that these are used to check their, backgrounds and credit. So that in itself are, ways of this community has been impacted, in segregated, discriminated, displaced, in a way. So all those policies, also related to requiring the ITINs or Social Security, there's also policies on occupancy. Oftentimes, an uncle moves in who lacks a legal status, but due to policies that demand that the household reports who lives in the unit, that has often led to lease violations and to evictions, because this family can't prove that the additional member in the household is related, or they can't prove that their identity. So.
And as we learned today, evictions are one of those places, unfortunately, at which Virginia excels. Yep. All right, Eric.
I guess from just my personal journey here, I've been pretty fortunate to be able to find a series of places. My strategy has kind of been to find old garden apartments away from the metro, off the beating track, and you take the bus and walk a lot. But I started off, 1960s garden apartments, went to a 1950s garden apartment, and now I just bought a place 2 years ago, built in 1939. So I've been fortunate there, but I do see myself, I have a kid on the way actually in a month. At some point in the future, there will be a decision of whether I can still live here or not. So I guess, related to this, my experience in involving in a whole bunch of community, political commissions and so forth and interactions around here, and I tend to also put feet in circles in different political camps that not everyone in this room perhaps fully appreciates. But I do think there's a sort of attitudinal difference regardless of political persuasion in this county right now based on generation. If you had moved into this county, loosely speaking, let's say you're mid-40s or older, but it's really when you moved here, you still look at this county primarily as a suburban, residential, middle-class community. You bought your home that was reasonably affordable, and you want to protect how your neighborhood looks. That's what you originally bought. People who moved here afterwards, I think, get the feeling that this is more of an urban area. And I think even if there is some resistance to doing X, Y, Z, when you talk to people, there's less resistance to changing all the things we talked about, more housing, more development, the NIMBY type stuff. So I think that is changing. One anecdote that I like to talk about a lot is when people complain about McMansions going up as teardowns. I say, well, what would you think about if instead of a McMansion we legalized it so a stacked duplex could go in place instead? That doesn't always win them over, but I'd say at least 50% of the time.
Frequently it does, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it's not so much that there's a new building going up, they just don't like their more gaudy, richer neighbor, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think there are some avenues on the margins. Minneapolis is considering an ordinance right now to upzone every single family neighborhood up to a fourplex.
Right.
I don't know if Arlington's that bold, but if you want to pass your progressive bona fides there on the county board, you do have the marker.
Taunting me, it sounds
Just
like,
saying.
right? All right, Tanya.
For me personally, it's going to boil down to affordability, especially considering the crippling student loan debt that I personally have. That's what's hindering me right now from entering the marketplace in Arlington personally. So I would love to be able to find a solution for that. And I know that, I work with a lot of, being an AYD, I get to exchange a lot of ideas with fellow young Dems in the area and just young professionals in general. And I found that I'm not alone in this. A lot of us are working 2 jobs to be able to sustain even just rent in an area like Clarendon, where oftentimes a lot of folks need to live because they need to be metro accessible. So those are the issues that personally I think that we're facing right now.
Indeed. All right, Adele.
Yeah, I'd agree. Definitely affordability for me personally, growing up and actually currently, because I always wanted to be located next to, the metro. So I have easier access to getting to and from work. But it's I find that it's very expensive to be located near the metro. So affordability is a huge one for me.
And, Saul, I don't know about you, since this has always been your home and, you've sort of returned as an adult, but it certainly sounded like for Eric, Tanya, and Adele, while you all have shown that you have great commitment and love for this community, you very much have part of your brain which is already considering the possibilities that affordability may exclude you, may push you out. And that's something that, to some degree, you've made, I won't say made peace with, but you've sort of reconciled that idea. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think so.
I think the question for all of us is that acceptable to us? Is that acceptable to us that people who have demonstrated such an incredible commitment to improving our community, to making it work according to our vision, is it okay that they have part of their brains that have accepted the fact that this may not be their permanent home? I just leave that as an open question. You don't have to answer. We do have limited time left with this panel, so I do want to give the opportunity, if there's a question or two from the audience, please line up behind the microphone, and we'll be sure to get you as soon as you get your question queued up. As we're ruminating on that, I did want to bring up quickly something that was said, the NIMBY dynamic, not in my backyard dynamic. I'd love to hear if you have any ideas about how we deal with that directly and head on, because it's something that really not only permeates this discussion, but just about everything. And with the full preface that we know, regardless of where you live, you'd probably much rather prefer a passive use like a park next to your house than anything else. So we know that that's what people would generally prefer. But how do we get past that soft preference that often metastasizes into a virulent opposition to anything that might promote some of the ideas that you're talking about? Saul.
Education, I don't know if you can hear me, education and outreach. Take it up on yourselves to educate your neighbors. Take the message along about the benefits of having an inclusive community of affordable housing, that it's not getting in your backyard, but also the benefit of it having, we've heard it from the researchers here, the benefit of having inclusive communities, inclusive schools. So that is a message that I ask each one of you to take out when you leave this event tonight, is to challenge yourself to take that message and educate, pass the word on the benefits, and get rid of that fear, because that is what it is. Mm-hmm. It is the fear of change. It is the sheer fear of difference. But as we heard tonight, it is a benefit for us all.
And I hope you would agree, too, that it's probably best to do that outreach not when there is an issue on the table that puts this into practice. You might want to sort of build this as a regular way of developing rapport with people.
Yeah, so that's not an easy one, as like you said, but I'll expand a little bit on what I said earlier. I get two things. I have had, I think, success talking with people when this brings out. When you talk about density, it's kind of people think of them making Clarendon or Ballston in your yard. I think what's appropriate is to find the incrementally dense building option for a neighborhood. People are a lot more calm when you say, can I put an English basement apartment in a townhouse? Can I do a duplex? As long as the form is the same. And I have sympathies for form-based code as potentially a tool to do this, though the details matter a lot because that has a tendency to get overly prescriptive. But I think if you ease people's fears that just means incremental, they're okay with that. On the multifamily side, when you are talking about putting up the big building, I've been told different things by different people, whether this is legal here under state law. I would love to see a simultaneous, systematic upglumping of areas mixed with a proffer for associated facilities, namely schools and parks. I wouldn't want just a proffer, that's a tax on development, makes everything more expensive. But you mix the two, I think that alleviates at least one of the pushbacks to denser building, and that it's what you're going to do with the schools, what are we going to do with parks, the public good type costs. But I think if it's possible to arrange both of those at the same time, which I'll leave that to you guys in the state legislature, I think that would alleviate at least some of the pushback to higher density building.
Thank you. Worthy of further study. Appreciate that.
I think if I had the answer to your question, we could solve like Middle East peace.
You're the expert in conflict resolution, Tanya.
And it's funny that you say that because my initial response is actually going to be echoing what Saul said, and that's to get people to dialogue and to really humanize each other. And I think from there, an exchange will naturally happen. That's a tough one, and that has to come from individuals saying, I want to get to know my neighbor, I want a better community, I want a holistic, inclusive community. And so hopefully people will leave with that today.
I mean, this young lady deals with Middle East conflict, and so I was expecting that we were going to get the answer, but no, I think what we know, though, is the best answers are really things that we've always known, right?
Right, exactly that.
And I want to piggyback on what
Yes.
Saul and Tanya said about education and how do we move forward from here, and how do we ensure that the history that we learned today isn't forgotten, just like Richard Rothstein and The Color of Law mentioned. And something that I haven't heard here today is about making a conscious effort to make sure that the history that we learn today is included in our education system, and that our children are learning about these issues as they're growing up. We want to make sure that, I mean, that's part of it, right? Part of removing the implicit biases is recognizing that we have them and talking about the history as it truthfully happened, and not just breezing over it or sugarcoating it, but just making sure, and each of us as individuals can make sure that this happens on the school level, making sure that this history is integrated into the curriculum.
All right, we're going to go to Mr. Green, and I think you'll conclude us, all right?
So I guess I have one comment because I have a microphone today, and then one question for everyone on the panel. My comment is, if you're not paying attention to the immigration nightmare that's happening at our borders in the southern part of this country, please pay attention to that. My question for you all, and it came to my mind because that comment came to mind because my question is actually sort of relevant. As I think about housing and homeownership in the way that I mentioned the American dream earlier and how that has shaped so much of our schema for housing in this country, I wanted to ask you all as voices of the future, do you have a sense of an American dream that you're pursuing? What does that look like, and is homeownership in its current ideal part of that dream for you?
Reflect on the American dream, and thank you, Jared, for both the linking and for the question. I imagine, Tanya, for you, somehow it includes a future without the overhang of student debt.
That
right?
would be great. The getting rid of student debt would be awesome. But yeah, absolutely. It absolutely includes having a home here. Putting down roots, even settling into Arlington, having the future that my parents left a country that was war-torn in hopes that I could have a better future here. And so I would love to be able to not only fulfill my American dream, but theirs as well.
How about you, Saul?
Like I said, I practically, I consider myself an Arlingtonian. I've lived here most of my life. And I want everyone to experience that and have that opportunity. As someone else in the previous panel said, that Arlington is our home. I feel that it is my home, and I want everyone else to have that experience. To enjoy the schools, I started going to school here at middle school in the 6th grade, and have that experience and have the opportunities that I had. But at the same time, improve on that. Make it a more diverse, a more inclusive community. I am originally from El Salvador. When I came here and I went to school, I fell in love with the schools. Why? Because back in my country, I was just another student. Whereas here, my peers were from Vietnam, from India, Bangladesh, Ukraine. It was a beautiful mix. And I had my white peers as well, my African American peers. It was a beautiful mix. I loved it. I had the opportunity to stay and be here, and it's the same experience that I want for others to live and enjoy, and that opportunity for kids in the school to grow up and get involved at a young age, to have that opportunity that I had, that I ran into Ms. Lois Athey when I was at a young age, and started looking at community issues. Is that sort of exposure that I want the youth to have, and to be involved in the community, look at issues, and come up with solutions. And one of the things I really loved doing when I was young, and I'm still young, is talking with the elderly. They have great experiences. They've lived their life. And I'm sure that those in the audience do that, but I highly encourage that you get someone that is young and share your experience, teaching about the issues that affect the community in their daily life, and hopefully someone will pick up on that as well and will continue your work, your legacy, what you're doing, or get involved and maybe just do a little bit, like myself, get involved and hope that with the little bit that we dedicate to this, that we contribute to that change. Yeah.
All right, Adele.
I think personally, my vision of the American dream is to buy a home in a community where, one, I can afford it, and two, where I'll feel comfortable taking my future children and my future children's children around the neighborhood where they feel welcome and included, especially in the education system, or within organizations that they join, within just the community in general. And then also to make sure that my family feels the same exact way and has a home to call their own. So that's my personal vision for what the American dream looks like. But then also for others to make sure that they have access to these same things and to a welcoming and including community. So it's a complicated answer. Actually, there's so many different aspects to the American dream that sometimes I feel like myself and other minorities don't have access to. So I feel like every day I'm rebuilding my definition of an American dream. And so it's complicated.
Thank you, Adele. And Eric.
I guess personally, I haven't actually given that all too much thought, other than the generic things. You eventually want to buy a place, feel secure, etc. My employer, I work for Fannie Mae, might shoot me if I say I think we sometimes overemphasize home ownership too much to the detriment. But I guess my concept of the American dream is kind of, the last phrase there in the 3 parts of Declaration of Independence there, pursuit of happiness. It's never been about necessarily some fixed thing, or even that you're actually going to get it, but that you have the opportunity to pursue things, that whatever it is you want, and that you realistically have a chance there. It's not a guarantee someone's going to hand something to you, but we're not going to get in your way if you're going to try to make it happen. So I very much dislike Both literal walls on national borders or figurative walls on zoning maps. And I very much spend a lot of my political energies trying to remove those barriers.
Well, thank you all. This terrific panel. I wish we had more than the 40 minutes. You know, I think for me, what's really, really heartwarming is hearing the concepts of the dream, even though they're going to be specific to each individual, and the vision for Arlington. It's kind of consistent across generations. There's a consistency there that's a source of strength. The real challenge for us is not only moving forward with real effective housing policies, and thanks so much to AHS and Michelle Winters for inviting me to take part in today's forum, but it's also how we deal with not only the issues of housing, but the new circumstances that people who are trying to buy in and make this area their home for the long term have that may have been unique from different generations, such as student debt or non-traditional ways of working or being able to verify your income or your credit worthiness, all sorts of things that we don't necessarily think about within this larger debate about inclusivity, but nonetheless play a huge role. Thank you to all of you for helping us explore those, and we appreciate your joining us today. Back over to Michelle.
Thank you so much. Only one more slide. And it's actually a quote from Northern Virginia Fair Housing Incorporated, which is that fair housing organization from the 1960s. I think this is, I didn't plan ahead. I didn't know what they were going to say. But from their flyer that they passed out in encouraging integration, they said, where the changing of a well-ingrained social pattern is involved, never underestimate the power of your expressed opinions. So I'll stop on that, and I invite you all to join us for the reception. Thank you for coming.